In the dry October of 1987, a 26-year-old woman named Fern Aldgate stood at the edge of a 60-acre property in the sandhills of western Nebraska and felt the wind try to take her hat. She let it. She was too busy looking at the land to care about the hat. The man selling it to her, a rancher named Mr. Decker, whose handshake felt like gripping a fence post, watched her with the particular expression of a person who has already decided the outcome of a conversation. He had driven her out in his truck along a rutted dirt track that ran between two sagging barbed wire fences, and now he stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops while she walked the perimeter of the first field in slow, deliberate steps. The land was not what most people would call promising. The soil was pale and sandy, the kind that shifted under your boots and held almost no moisture. The grass that clung to it was sparse and yellowish, the variety that signals surrender rather than growth. There was a low-lying depression in the center of the property, maybe 8 acres, where the ground dipped and then flattened into something that might have been a meadow once, or perhaps a seasonal wetland. Before, the water table dropped and left it empty and useless. A line of cottonwoods along the eastern edge were the only trees, and they looked tired, the way trees do when they have been standing alone too long. "This used to be dryland wheat country," Mr. Decker said, following her at a respectful distance. 3 different families tried it. The Holloways, the Birch family, a fella named Orrin Stout. All of them planted wheat, all of them got beaten by drought or low prices or both. The Stout family, they tried rye for a season, ground's too sandy, doesn't hold fertilizer long enough to matter. Nutrients go right through it. He paused. "I'm not trying to talk you out of it. I'm just being straight with you." Fern nodded without looking at him. She was crouching now, scooping up a handful of the pale soil and letting it sift through her fingers. It was almost too light. It fell like something that had given up. "What's your asking price again?" she said. He told her. It was, by the standards of the time, almost embarrassingly low. Even so, it would take everything she had, and a little she didn't. "I'll take it," she said. Mr. Decker didn't laugh out loud. He was too polite for that. But she heard the quality of his silence, the way it held something back that wanted very much to be said. She signed the papers in his kitchen 3 days later, on a table that smelled of coffee and old dog, while his wife refilled his mug and looked at Fern with the gentle, practiced pity of someone watching a kitten step into a river. Fern thanked them both and drove her truck back down the highway, with the deed on the passenger seat and a feeling in her chest that was not quite joy and not quite terror, but something that lived in the narrow strip between the two. Now, let me tell you something about Fern Aldgate before we go any further, because you need to understand who she was and where she came from to understand what she did next. She had grown up in the house of a woman named Iris Aldgate, her grandmother, on a small and mostly unremarkable property in the Platte River Valley. Her parents had left when she was 4, her father first, her mother some years after, and so it was Iris who raised her. Iris was not a warm woman in the obvious sense. She did not bake things or tell stories at bedtime. What she did instead was take Fern out into the fields every morning before school and teach her to look. Not to look at the crops in the way that most farmers looked, always scanning for problems, always counting against loss. Iris looked differently. She looked with curiosity. She would kneel in the dirt and study the way a particular plant was leaning, not as a sign of sickness, but as a message. She watched where the water pooled after a rain and asked what that shape told her about what the land wanted. She kept a small notebook, pale blue with a cracked spine, in which she wrote down observations that would have seemed eccentric to anyone who found it. The date when the meadowlarks arrived in spring, which corner of the south field dried first, what the grasshoppers were doing this summer before a hard drought. Most people argue with the land, Iris told Fern once, kneeling in the dirt at the edge of the lower pasture with her sleeve rolled up and her hand pressed flat against the ground. They decide what they want to grow, and then they fight the ground into growing it. That's one way. You can do that, but you'll spend your whole life fighting, and the land will still be here after you're gone, doing exactly what it was always going to do. She looked at Fern steadily. Or you can ask it what it already knows how to do, and then get out of the way. Iris died when Fern was 22, leaving her a small amount of money, the pale blue notebook, and a lesson that did not come with instructions for how to apply it. Fern spent the next 4 years doing various things. Waitressing, working a season for a commercial vegetable operation in Colorado, taking an incomplete degree in agronomy at the community college, while she tried to figure out what to do with something she knew to be true but couldn't quite yet prove. Then she found the land in the sandhills, and she understood, or began to. The news of her purchase moved through the surrounding county in the casual, efficient way that news moves through small, rural places. At the grain elevator, at the hardware store, at the diner on Main Street, where the ranchers and dryland farmers gathered on Saturday mornings, the conversation was the same. Fern Aldgate, the Iris Aldgate girl, had bought the old Stout place. 60 acres of sand and wishful thinking, paid cash money for it, or near enough. A man named Mr. Thurston, who farmed several hundred acres of center pivot corn to the north, shook his head over his eggs. Sandy ground like that, he said, you can't fight it into producing. The water just runs through. She'd have been better off buying a trailer house and a lottery ticket. He wasn't being mean. He was being what he understood to be reasonable. A woman named Mr. Harwick, everyone called him that, even though his first name was Eugene, because he had been Mr. Harwick for so long that the first name had simply stopped existing, ran the local agricultural lending office. Fern came to him 6 weeks after the purchase, hat in hand, with a business plan she had typed up herself on a borrowed computer. She sat across from his desk in a chair that had been chosen to make visitors feel slightly shorter than they were. She laid out her plan calmly and methodically. She talked about the sandy soil, its drainage characteristics, its low nutrient retention, and then she pivoted. She talked about a crop called millet, specifically proso millet, which thrived in exactly the kind of light, fast-draining soil that had beaten 3 generations of wheat farmers. She talked about the low-lying depression at the center of the property, the 8-acre hollow that everyone had dismissed as useless drainage waste. She talked about what happened when you took that hollow, bermed the edges slightly, and encouraged it to hold shallow, seasonal water. She talked about waterfowl, about the Central Flyway, the ancient migratory corridor that runs like an invisible highway directly over the Nebraska sandhills, carrying tens of millions of ducks and geese south every fall and north every spring, about what those birds needed more desperately than almost anything else along that flyway: shallow, food-rich water to rest and refuel. She was proposing a hunting preserve and waterfowl staging area. The millet grown in the upland fields, a crop the sandy soil could actually support, would be partially harvested for income and partially left standing at the field edges to feed the birds. The wetland hollow would be managed to hold water through the fall migration. She would charge hunters for access during season. She would offer guided hunts. She would build a modest blind or two, nothing elaborate, and let the Central Flyway do the advertising. Mr. Harwick listened to all of this with his fingers laced on the desk in front of him. He had the look of a man who is giving something his full attention out of professional courtesy, while his internal opinion has already been rendered. When she finished, he unclasped his hands and picked up a pen, not to write anything, just to hold. "Fern," he said, and the way he said her first name told her everything about how this conversation was going to end. "I appreciate the thought you've put into this. I do. But what you're describing, a hunting preserve on 60 acres of sandy ground, that's not a farm. That's a hobby. The millet market is thin. The waterfowl hunting market in this area is, at best, seasonal. You have no track record, no collateral to speak of, and what you're proposing depends entirely on whether birds happen to show up. You're asking me to lend money against migration patterns." He set the pen down. "I can't do that in good conscience." She looked at him for a long moment. "The birds will come," she said, "if the habitat is right." "That may be," he said, "but I'm not able to loan against faith." She thanked him politely and left. The bank 2 towns over said essentially the same thing, though they used different words. "Have you ever had an idea that you were so certain of that it lived in you like a physical fact, like the weight of a stone in your hand, and yet you could not find a single person in the world who could feel what you felt? Not because they were foolish, but because what you knew had come from somewhere that could not be explained in a loan application or a spreadsheet." That was Fern's position in the winter of 1987. She had the land. She had the knowledge her grandmother had pressed into her like a seed into soil, and she had nothing else. So she did what people do when institutions will not help them. She sold things. She sold her truck and bought a cheaper one. She sold a small collection of antique tools that her grandmother had left her, items she had told herself she would never sell, and she stood in the parking lot of the flea market afterward and looked at the money in her hand and did not let herself feel the loss until that night, alone in the small rented room where she was staying, when she allowed herself exactly 1 hour of it. Then she put it away and went to sleep. The first winter, she worked the land by hand and with a small borrowed tractor. She built the berms around the low hollow with a rented blade, moving the sandy soil in slow arcs, learning as she went. She seeded the upland fields with millet in the spring and watched it come up thin and uncertain, the way everything looks in its first season, like an idea that hasn't quite decided to commit. She mowed a rough parking area near the road. She built one blind out of cedar posts and native grass, the kind of structure that looks like the land grew it. The skeptics watched from the road. She had become, without asking for it, something of a local story. The Aldgate girl and her bird farm. Mr. Thurston drove past once and slowed his truck to look, then accelerated. She saw his brake lights flicker on and off the way a person's face does when they are suppressing something. The millet came in that summer at half the yield she had hoped for. A man at the co-op weighed her load and entered the number in his ledger without comment. The number was not good. She knew it before he said it, and she nodded and drove home. And then the fall came. I want to describe this carefully, because what happened in October of that first year was not dramatic in the way that stories are usually dramatic. There were no trumpets. There was no single moment of revelation. What there was instead was a sound. Fern was out at the hollow at dusk on a Thursday evening in the first week of October. Checking the water level, the hollow had filled slowly through September, fed partly by the seasonal table, and partly by a small diversion she had dug from a drainage swale at the north end of the property. The water was maybe 8 inches deep across most of the basin. Not deep, deliberately not deep. Shallow water is warm water. Warm, shallow water grows the aquatic invertebrates and soft-stemmed vegetation that migrating waterfowl need like fuel for an engine. She was standing at the edge of the water when she heard it, not from one direction, but from everywhere above her, a sound like wind becoming alive. She looked up. The sky was moving. It was mallards, mostly, though there were pintails mixed in, and teal, and some birds she couldn't immediately name in the fading light. They were dropping out of the sky in long spiraling columns, their wings set, bodies angled, feet extended. Dozens. Then more. The hollow, which had been empty and silent a moment before, became a churning, quacking, wing-flapping body of birds settling onto the water. And then more came and more, and she stood at the edge of it with her hands at her sides while the sound washed over her. She allowed herself to feel it, and then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and went home to check her trap counts. She had set 6 waterfowl survey traps, the kind wildlife biologists use, along the margins of the hollow. Trapping was not the point. She released everything she caught, but the counts were her data. The first trap held 17 birds, the second 11. The third was so full that the door had jammed. Fern sat down in the wet grass at the edge of the hollow, surrounded by sound, and understood that the land had answered. That first season, she hosted 9 hunting parties on guided day trips. She charged $200 per person. She had a waiting list by the 3rd weekend. The millet income, thin as it was, combined with the hunting revenue, was enough to pay her land taxes, cover her fuel and seed costs for the following year, and leave a small cushion that she put immediately back into the property. She expanded the berm on the east side. She seeded an additional strip of millet along the property boundary. She ordered seed packets for native sedge and bulrush, the plants that would make the shallow water more productive, more alive, more attractive to the birds that were already finding her, telling each other in whatever language migration runs on. There is water here. There is food. Here is a place to rest. Year by year, she ran the same process. She never took on debt. Every expansion was paid for by the previous season's margin. She learned the specific patterns of her own hollow, which week the pintails tended to arrive, which corner of the basin the teal preferred, how the water level needed to drop by November to attract the divers rather than just the dabblers. She kept a notebook, pale blue, new, but kept in the same spirit as the cracked one her grandmother had left her. Observations, not accounts. The millet yields began to climb in the 3rd season, not because the soil had changed, but because she had learned it. She adjusted her seeding density. She shifted her planting date by 12 days, based on what the drainage pattern told her about soil temperature. She found varieties suited to this specific type of ground that the university extension guides did not prominently feature because they were not varieties suited to most ground. She was farming for her land, not for average land. The word began to change. It changed slowly, the way all important things change in agricultural communities, not in announcements but in pauses. In the way Mr. Thurston's truck slowed a little more before accelerating. In the way the feed store clerk started asking, without quite knowing why, how her season was going. In the way the diner conversation shifted, almost imperceptibly, from certainty to curiosity. Did you hear about the Aldgate girls' hunt numbers this season? 300 birds through there in a week. I don't know how she does it. The ground's nothing. 60 acres, and she's got a waiting list. The numbers, when they began to circulate, made people uncomfortable in the way that math makes you uncomfortable when it refuses to add up to what you expected. In the fall of 1999, 12 years after she had signed the deed on Mr. Decker's kitchen table, Mr. Harwick came to see her. He drove out on a Tuesday morning, his sedan looking incongruous on her rutted gravel drive. He was wearing his work clothes, slacks, and a pressed shirt, which looked wrong against the backdrop of her barn and her millet stubble and the dark smear of birds circling over the hollow in the gray autumn light. Fern met him at her truck, which was parked near the first blind, and she waited. He had come to her. She had learned, in the years since his office, that there was a particular kind of patience required for moments like this one. You did not rush them. You did not fill the silence prematurely. Mr. Harwick stood for a while looking at the hollow, at the birds on the water, at the millet field with its yellow stalks still standing along the margins. He looked at the 2 permanent blinds she had built, and the small equipment shed and the gravel lot with its dozen parking spots, which she had put in the previous year because she kept running out of room. "I pulled your accounts," he said finally, "from the co-op, from your tax filings, what I could see. I hope you don't mind." "I don't mind," she said. "Your profit per acre is—" He stopped, started again. "It's remarkable. I've been in agricultural lending for 24 years. I don't think I've seen numbers like that on 60 acres, not even close." He turned to look at her. "I told you I couldn't loan against migration patterns." "You did," Fern said. "I was wrong." He said it simply, the words falling out of him without ceremony. "I didn't understand what you were doing. I was thinking about it as a farm that would have to fight the land. I didn't see that you were proposing a farm that would work with it." He paused. "I'm sorry for that. If you ever want to expand or purchase additional acreage or need capital for anything at all, the credit is there, whatever you need." Fern looked at the hollow, at the birds settling on the water in their slow wheeling descent, at the pale grass bending in the early November wind. "Thank you, Mr. Harwick," she said. "I don't think I'll be needing it." He nodded. He looked again at the birds on the water, for a long moment the way a person looks at something they are trying to memorize. Then he got in his sedan and drove back down the gravel drive. "Let me take you forward now, because that is not where the story ends. That is only where one chapter of it closes. Fern Aldgate never acquired 500 acres with a pivot irrigation system and a fleet of equipment. She never wanted to. What she did, instead, was purchase 3 additional parcels over the following decade, all of them land that other people had given up on, a wetland margin no one could drain, a rocky upland that no row crop planter could navigate, a narrow floodplain corridor that flooded every 3 years and sat empty in between. She paid low prices for all of them because no one else wanted them. She learned each one the way her grandmother had taught her. She sat with them in different seasons. She tracked their water and their wind and their birds and their insects. She farmed each of them for what they already knew how to do, not for what she wished they would do. She developed a reputation that spread, quietly and without her seeking it, through the conservation and hunting communities of the central flyway states. People called from Iowa, from the Dakotas, from Kansas, asking not just for hunting access but for advice. She gave it freely. She drove out to properties in her truck, walked the ground with other farmers, pointed at depressions and drainage patterns, and said, "Lisk, look at the shape of what's here. Ask it what it already knows." The farmers who had once shaken their heads in the diner began to come to her with their own questions. They came with their hats in their hands, and their certainty replaced, at last, by something more useful. She answered them without ceremony. She did not hold anything back and did not say, "I told you," because she understood, the way her grandmother had understood, that the point was never to be right. The point was to listen well enough that the land could use you. On a cold morning in November, early enough that the light is still more gray than gold, you might see her standing at the edge of the hollow. The water is up, the way it gets in October when the rains have been kind, and the surface is covered with birds, mallards and gadwall, and the occasional canvasback that has drifted off the main flyway corridor and found this small, bright place in the sand hills of western Nebraska. She is holding a notebook, pale blue, slightly cracked along the spine from the way she always bends it open, and she is writing something down, not a profit figure, not a yield calculation. Something she noticed, something the land said that she is making sure to remember. Beside her, At the edge of the water stands a girl of about 10, her niece, in rubber boots that are slightly too large. The girl is not looking at the birds. She is looking at the water, at the way it moves at the edge where the sedge grass grows, the way small things ripple the surface from underneath. "What's down there?" the girl asks. Fern crouches beside her and looks at the same spot. "Invertebrates," she says, "little bugs and crustaceans. They're what the birds come for, really. The millet is part of it. But this," she gestures at the water, at the undisturbed edge where things are living and cycling and doing what they do. "This is the engine." The girl thinks about this for a moment. "How did you know to make it like this?" she says. Fern looks out the water for a long time. She thinks of her grandmother's hand, pressed flat against the soil. She thinks of the pale blue notebook with the cracked spine, the one that is folded up now in a cedar box in the back of her closet, too worn to use but too important to lose. She thinks of an October evening in 1987, when the sky above this hollow opened up and became a living, breathing river of wings, and she understood that she had not created something but only prepared a place for something that already wanted to exist. "I didn't," she says finally. "I just asked the land what it already knew. And then I got out of the way." The girl nods, not quite understanding, but storing it somewhere. The birds settle. The water moves. The November light comes up slow and thin over the sandhills, and the hollow fills with the sound of things living exactly where they belong. In the county records, the land is still listed as marginal, poor drainage, sandy soil, low productivity. But the birds know better, and so does Fern.